Let's talk about the father of bourbon. So I got a question. I'm Daniel, by the way, Daniel Whittington, Wizard Academy Chancellor, and also of Whiskey Marketing School. In the comments, at Tobin_Nathan, so maybe Nathan Tobin, who knows? He said, hey, anytime Daniel's sidebars and said, this is super nerdy, then I know I'm gonna comment on a video topic request. So here it is, the history of E.H. Taylor's bourbon law contributions. So I'm gonna give it to you. Okay, so, and we're gonna drink some Budget Taylor, because why not? Budget bourbon. Colonel Edmund Haynes Taylor Jr., born in Columbus, Kentucky, 1832, had two presidents in his family history, James Madison and Zachary Taylor. He worked as a banker and a politician, and he was the mayor for 16 years in Frankfurt. And originally, he got into the whiskey industry through the door of banking because, as everybody knows, to run a business and make money, you got to work with banks most often. And he became really close with a whole bunch of high-level bourbon producers and sort of fell in love with it, so much so that when he had the chance in 1869, he purchased an old distillery and then revived it and named it the OFC Distillery, which stands for Old... No, I'm just kidding. That's terrible. It stands for... It stands for Old-Fashioned Copper. So he named it the Old-Fashioned Copper Distillery, but he shortened it to OFC. But he immediately did a bunch of things that were a big deal. He switched to copper fermentation tanks. He upgraded, he put in column stills. He upgraded or created a sort of more refined, efficient sour mash process. He modernized all the buildings. He built a train station and updated road infrastructure to his distillery. He was one of the first in all of whiskey history, American whiskey history, sorry, and all of American whiskey history to take the idea of making his place a visiting destination for tourists very seriously. So he did tours, he did samples of products, he did events at the distillery, he did merchandising. This dude was a businessman. I think he came through the door of banker. So he's looking for, where does this turn into money, right? And most of the distilleries, and this was actually, I was just talking to, today, actually. I was just talking to Martin Duffy. And we were talking about how for the longest time, even in Scotland, the vast majority of the distilleries were just old production blue-collar work facilities. Like, they weren't fancy with visitor centers and tours and state-of-the-art anything. It was just, it's a factory. And if you went to them, if you were even allowed to, it was a factory tour. It is not a tourism spot. But, and this was true of a lot of bourbon distilleries, but not him. He upgraded everything. He actually designed his distillery to look like a medieval castle, which, foreshadowing, I'll tell you something about later, including a spring house and sunken gardens as a part of his infrastructure. Now, he ran into financial trouble because he grew and built and invested in so big that the income didn't keep up with it. And so in 1878, he reaches out to a name that you've probably never heard of, George T. Stagg. And George T. Stagg buys the distillery and then hires Taylor to run it. Now, Colonel E.H. Taylor, he's called not because he has military background, but because the Kentucky governor named him a Kentucky colonel, which is a thing. I'm actually a Kentucky colonel. I don't know if you guys knew that. A couple of really cool Psalms and friends of mine in the community nominated me, and I got a plaque in the mail. It says Daniel Whittington, Colonel of Kentucky. It's unbelievable. It's weird. It's very weird, but very kind of them. Very cool. I would argue, though. Oh, and by the way, after George T. Stagg bought it and hired Taylor to run it, he renamed it the George T. Stagg Distillery. I would argue that that's not why he's the father of bourbon, though. You could argue he invented modern bourbon tourism. He did all kinds of really cool stuff. He funded a lot of the early days of the real big names of bourbon history. But there's something else that makes him the father of bourbon. We're going to talk about that in a second. But first, Old Taylor, which, by the way, is, I think now a Buffalo Trace product. For the longest time, it wasn't. It was Beam. Beam owned it. I mean, it went through multiple hands. So Stagg, then National Distillers, and then it changed, and then it was Beam Global, and now it's Buffalo Trace. At one point, the 6 right here was an age statement, so it said aged 6 years, and then at some point, they just removed the aged in years and left the number 6. Well, it's like the Jack Daniel's 7, where I can't count how many people I know who think that that's 7-year-old bourbon, but it's, if you look to the left, it says number 7 recipe. Oh, Lord. But, so, I don't know, this is probably Buffalo Trace produced product. There's no age statement. It is straight bourbon with no age statement, so that means it's 4 years old. It says their budget, it's so budget, they don't even talk about it on their website. At all. This is in the, under $20 bottle range. But one of the things I love about big companies that I think are a positive thing about companies like Beam and Jack Daniel's and Buffalo Trace and so on is that even their budget stuff, it's close, even their budget stuff is reasonably high quality. And so for an under sub $20 bottle of bourbon, if I went to a wedding or just a bar on a motorcycle ride out in the hill country and they had Old Taylor bourbon, I'd be like, yeah, absolutely, I'll drink that. In the nose, paper thin, a little bit shiny, and then surrounding that some caramel and some candy corn and some dense sweetness. But it is very thin, more ethanol than it is anything else. A little bit of vanilla, a little bit of dried grass. On the palate, just plain, simple, sweet, generic whiskey flavors. The kinds of flavor compounds you find in anything that's touched new oak, of any grain, because so much of that flavor is coming from barrel use and then proofed down. But it's nice. I don't drink it and go, oh God, ugh. I drink it and go, it's fine. I would put that in Coke. I drink it on the rocks. Actually, it might be a little light on the rocks. Put it in a bourbon-based cocktail. Drink it when I'm at a party when they don't have anything else and be just fine with it. It's fine. When you're that big, you can afford to make budget products that are decent. I am going to add water to it, even though there's no reason. And we all know this is going to turn out badly. But it's okay. So why is Colonel E.H. Taylor the father of bourbon according to people? Because it is largely because of his push and aggressive influence, as well as a few other people's. He didn't do it single-handedly, but he was a huge proponent of legal requirements and restrictions around bourbon and whiskey in North America. Now you got to keep in mind, at this time, this is late 80s, early 1900s, late 80s mostly, or late 1800s. This is the era of the rectifiers. And what that means, this is the era when you have a whole bunch of people, because there are no rules around making whiskey, and they are doing all kinds of shit. At the time, you could sell whiskey by the barrel, and so you would have these guys who were called drummers, and they would buy a barrel of whiskey from somewhere, and then they would get it on a wagon, and they'd head off to small towns to sell whiskey. And it would occur to some of the less scrupulous drummers that if they could somehow make this barrel of whiskey 2 barrels of whiskey, they could double their money. And what you would find is them finding old barrels and sort of distributing their bourbon across barrels and then refilling it with like neutral grain spirits like a vodka, often made out of anything from molasses to sugar to whatever. And then to get the flavor back into it, adding things like molasses or like acid or like tobacco juice or like, I mean, there were things that killed people in those creosote. There's just burnt flavoring, right? I have a book from that era that gives you actual recipes on how to create Scotch, bourbon, Canadian whiskey, and Irish whiskey, starting with vodka. It's actual recipe with ingredients. We made it at one point on the Tribe channel, and it was actually tasted like mediocre Canadian whiskey. Anyway, so they were in that era. You have all these bourbon producers sort of fighting, going like, hey, this is real. That's not. We need rules. And out of that push came the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897. I'm not going to cover it in full length here because it's in a video I've already shot, but effectively it means that you can, if you have the label Bottled and Bond on your whiskey, it meant that it conformed to the 1897 Bottled and Bond Act that was, he was one of the proponents of. One distiller, one season, one distillery, at least 4 years old, bottled at 100 proof. That's pretty straight up. And because of that, you could argue it sort of saved and cornered out and legitimized the bourbon industry as a whole in the US. And that's what makes him the father of bourbon. Nose is a little nicer with water. It actually gets a little more toasted vanilla and a darker sweetness. It's way more watery. Even with a few drops, it tastes watery. Nose is better. Palate, worse. But it is what it is. I could have done like the full-on Colonel E.H. Taylor release, but strangely, it's hard to find those. I don't know why. By the way, to finish it up, George T. Stagg Distillery would eventually become the current Buffalo Trace Distillery. So them bringing this back is kind of a full circle. And the historic Old Taylor Distillery, the one where he started the OFC, was purchased, renovated, and became the Castle and Key Distillery, which I've reviewed on this channel. Nerd alert. All right. Cheers to you all, and I'm really glad you're here. If you want the original channel, old-fashioned channel for whiskey reviews, like and subscribe.